From the author of Spinsterella, The Strange and Unusual Romance and Spellbound, A Darker Shade of Black comes the legendary Magic Tilda. Pick up the conclusions of the Spinsterella trilogy in paperback and e-readers this Halloween. I was at the library watching several videos talking about the death of the comic book industry, and after watching Diversity in Comics, Captain Cummings, and Just Some Guy's videos where they talked about the death of the comic book industry, I'm inclined to agree with them. As a guy who has studied the comic book industry for over 20 years and has published his own titles for the last 8 years, I have talked about many of the numerous issues that they talked about in their videos and how they were leading to the decline of the comic book industry. I even wrote an ebook back in about 2011, I think, called The Analysis of the Comic Book Industry's Business Issues, where I talked about many of these issues way back then. And back then I had people who were panning me for talking about many of these serious issues that were related to the comic book industry, and now I'm seeing many of those issues come to a head with August sales numbers. Now, the numbers for August were some of the worst in the history of the comic book industry. These numbers were so bad, they were actually worse than the numbers that were related to the 1997 collapse. Even though Marvel had gone bankrupt and the industry had hit a huge collapse in 1997, they were still at least able to sell 100,000 copies of A-list books like Batman, X-Men, Spider-Man, the Hulk, and Superman. Those books were able to continuously sell very strongly. Moreover, even I could go back even further, even than that, to the 1980s, where some of these books were doing 200 to 300,000 copies. I mean, B and C list characters like Captain America and Iron Man were doing at least 250,000 in sales. And books like X-Men back in 87, 88, and 89, when I was in high school, were selling 500,000 units. So we're looking at least a 90% drop in sales when you compare the numbers for August of 2017 to going back to, say, August of 1987. If I were to go back 30 years, I'm seeing a 90% drop in terms of sales. And if I go back to 1997, again, I'm seeing a 50% drop in sales. And to look at those numbers, they show me a comic book industry in crisis. And what's really sad about this crisis is all the denial many people in the comic book industry continue to remain in. They continue to not acknowledge these problems. They think they can ride it out, and some people think they can save the comic book industry by using the same approaches that didn't work. The definition of insanity is doing the exact same things and expecting a different result, yet we have people at Marvel and DC who still think they can continue to apply the exact same failed approaches that have collapsed the comic book industry in the 1990s to 2017. And that's one of the core problems that's related to this comic book industry, is that we still have people who are still stuck in the 1990s way of thinking and the 1990s way of framework. Because what happened in the 1990s is we had a big explosion of popularity, and with that big explosion of popularity, unfortunately, came the craft was not taught to the next generation. And this is why we have so many really bad comics coming out from these trade comic publishing houses, because no one sat down and passed craft on to the next generation. Guys like Jim Shooter had left Marvel, and many of the other people had left Marvel, and there was nobody there to teach craft at Marvel. And then you had at DC, yes, you had a little bit of a better structure, but again, craft was not taught to the next generation. You didn't have an editor mentoring a new writer or a new talent, because we had these superstars like Todd McFarlane, the Rob Liefelds, and the Jim Lees come up, and they thought that their way was the best way. And then you had a lot of artists coming in thinking they could just do whatever they want. A lot of writers coming in thinking they could do whatever they want. And because they thought this way, the product really declined, because there was no standard for quality. And because there was no standard for quality, again, this is what led to the collapse of the comic book industry, not to mention the oversaturation of product that was coming out in the 1990s And sadly, people are still trying to apply the same approaches. Now, in 1997, there was that Heroes Return, which tried to set things right. Unfortunately, everything fell apart around 2001 for Marvel. And in 2002, everything fell apart for DC with the hiring of Dan Dido, a man who had no publishing experience, who was picked to run DC Comics. And both of those decisions, they led to the collapse of the comic book industry, because in 2001, after Kurt Busiek and many other people and George Perez and many others who managed to shore up these relaunch titles of Avengers, Fantastic Four, Iron Man, and Captain America left, the books went right back to a decline, and then we had another reboot over there. But then in DC, we had Dan Dido destroying many characters in stories like Identity Crisis and Infinite Crisis, and that led to a serious decline. Then the New 52 came along, and that led to about a 6 or 7 year decline with DC Comics. And then we had Marvel just talking about they wanted to go on this diversity campaign, and this is where the state of the comic book industry is right now. A lot of people were alienated by all these reboots. They were alienated by these relaunches. People have been collecting for 20, 30 years. I've heard from them on Facebook and YouTube, and they said these were the reasons why they left the comic book industry and they stopped buying comics, because the characters that they knew were gone, the stories that they knew were gone, and everything that they knew and cared about, it seemed like the company had no regard for it when they went out and did these reboots and relaunches, and they felt like there was no incentive to keep buying these stories because the characters they knew were gone. And you have DC and Marvel right now, and many of these indies, they're still trying to apply these 90s approaches, not understanding each approach that you apply from this 90s model just doesn't work, and it leads to the industry further declining. And what exacerbates the situation is, again, you have people who don't understand the publishing business out here trying to publish books. At DC, you have Dan Dido and Jim Lee, who bankrupted Wildstorm, still trying to apply 90s approaches to DC. And yes, they've had a little bit of success with Rebirth, but it's nowhere near where it should be. This storyline is just taking too long. Jeff Johns has this vision, but this vision isn't working. I said it wasn't going to work because a 2-year storyline is just not going to work. Just like the Secret Empire with Nick Spencer, it didn't work because the audience has changed. And when you look at the audience, they can pick up an entire Netflix series and watch that in a day, an entire television series in a day. Nobody's going to wait 2 years for a comic book storyline to resolve when they can watch a Netflix series in a day, or they can watch one of these CW superhero shows in a whole 5 to 6 months of a television season. So this type of model, it just doesn't work anymore. I mean, it worked back in the 80s when you had television and that was your only competition, but comic books these days compete against numerous forms of media, and those numerous forms of media include these streaming shows, YouTube videos, television shows, and home video. So comics have to compete, and this is one of the big problems with comic book publishers, is that they don't understand where they stand in the marketplace. They don't understand that in a competitive marketplace, no one is going to sit there and wait for you. And when you have a long, drawn-out story like a Secret Empire or this Rebirth, people walk away from you because they have options that will allow them to be entertained. Moreover, they have options that allow them to be entertained for a lower entertainment value per dollar. Your average comic book these days costs anywhere from $3 to $5, and that price is just too high when you consider the entire entertainment values per dollar that people get from buying a Netflix subscription, which is only $12 a month, but you can watch as many shows as you want, a Spotify subscription where you can listen to as many songs as you want, YouTube, which is absolutely free, or even independent publishers like myself who offer 300, 400-page books for $3.99 or $4.99. Your average comic book is only 32 pages, and they talk about $3.99 to $4.99, but the digital version of a novel like this Spinsterella, this is only $3.99. So the reader is getting an entertainment value per dollar where they can read an entire novel for the price of a comic book. And that's not giving them an incentive to go out here and buy comics. And what makes it even worse for the comic book industry has been the distribution model for comics. Diamond has been the only place where you can buy comics and order comics, and that has put one foot in the comic book industry's grave, because with Diamond, comics are not returnable. So that cuts off 90% of your retail access, because most retailers out here, I'm telling you as a publishing professional, will not take a product that is not returnable. This is something I learned when I started SJS Direct, and if you do not have returnability, you are cutting yourself off from a major portion of the marketplace. And the comic book industry has not been returnable since the 1990s. This is why many of your grocery stores, many of your drugstores, many of your outside venues where people, like newsstands, where people used to buy comics, can't get them anymore, because when comics aren't returnable, people aren't going to order them. And what makes it worse now is you have even comic shops not wanting to order comics, because what a lot of people don't understand about sales for comic books is this. The number of comics that you see in those numbers that Captain Cummings and Diversity in Comics presented to you, those are the numbers for what is ordered. And that's not what is sold. Usually when there's a returnability clause in a contract for sales of publications, what happens is that you get an actual number of what is sold. But because there's no returnability, all we know is that the comic shop ordered 200,000 copies of something like Dark Knight's Metal, or 100,000 copies of Batman, but we don't know how many they sold, because that's what's really been crippling the comic book industry, and that's what's led to so many shops being closed, is the fact that many of these comic shops just can't move product. They're ordering comics, and they're being stuck with so many of them due to all of these events and things like these reboots. And when you have a reboot on top of a reboot on top of a reboot, that gives, again, the customer less incentive to go out here and buy the product. They're sitting there saying, you know, I'm waiting for a stable universe so I can continue to buy these products on a regular, but you keep changing them, I have no incentive to buy them. So they're sitting there saying, the customer's saying one thing, but the sad part is the publishers just aren't listening. They continue to do the exact same things and expect a different result. And again, that's called insanity. This is why I say there's a desperate need for new management at Marvel Comics. There's a desperate need for new management at DC Comics. Now, Diversity in Comics has said that Marvel is the state and the health of the industry, and yes, I have to agree with him based on the numbers that I saw. But I also say DC is a part of the health of the industry as well. If both companies aren't doing strong, then you don't have that large audience of customers to come into a comic shop to buy comics. Moreover, you don't have the kids interested in going to try to find comics. And that really hurts the indies, because what happens with the indies is they get a lot of their business indirectly from people going to look for Marvel and DC Comics. If there are no kids or adults coming in to buy Marvel and DC Comics, then nobody's going to try indies, because that's how I used to buy comics back when I was a teenager back in the 80s. I would go to a place like Forbidden Planet, and that's where I would find a lot of indies, and their business is dying because you have Marvel and DC in such a sad state. And the reason why Marvel and DC are in such a sad state is because you have people who are grossly unqualified working at both companies, people who don't understand the publishing business, and people who don't understand that their approaches just don't work, and you have to try something new. And you really need, again, a publishing professional to come in who loves comics and understands the publishing business, because as a publishing professional who understands the business, I can look at both companies' catalogs and say they have way too many books being released on their monthly catalog, because for your front list, you should not have any more than about 12 or 16 titles. Marvel has over 100, and when you do something like that, it overwhelms the customer. There's just too many books coming out, and the readers can't buy them all. Back in the day, you used to have maybe 12, 16 titles, and a kid with an allowance could go out and they could buy all those titles for maybe $25, $30, and it wouldn't hurt because it was done over the course of a month. These days, when you have 100 titles, there's no way you can read them all. And when they're all interconnected into one big storyline, that is going to cost somebody at $3 or $4 a copy, $300, $400, or at the end of the storyline, maybe a couple of $1,000s. So comics have priced themselves out, especially when you consider, again, other forms of media like your Netflix or even indie books like mine, like these ISIS series books, where the entire story is in one volume. This one paperback, again, is only $8.99, and the story is complete in one volume. You don't have to buy, hundreds of books to complete a story. This is one of the other big problems with the comic book industry, is that these long, drawn-out stories aren't giving readers an incentive to come in. A new reader wants to be able to just pick up one book, come right in, and start reading. That's something they can't do with today's comics. They've been waiting for that type of story model, but the sad part is nothing is changing, and that's why the industry is flatlining right now, because you just have people in the industry who, one, are grossly unqualified, two, who don't want to be there, and three, don't really care about the products they're producing. You can't save an industry by having the people who destroy it still continuing to work in it. This is why what I said in a previous video when I talked about Dan Dido, when he was talking about how we need to save the industry. I mean, how can you ask him and Jim Lee to save DC when it was their implementation of the New 52 which led to the decline of DC? And how can you ask Axel Alonso and Tom Beverett to save Marvel when it was their implementation of this SJW agenda and these diversity characters that led to the decline of Marvel? No, you need new people to come in if you hope to try to save these two companies' brands, because you have to have a new vision for comics, a new direction for comics, and a new plan to bring these characters to readers in the 21st century. It's a shame that these characters in their purest forms can sell billions of dollars in merchandise in movie theaters and in stores like Walmart, but they can't sell comic books these days. And the reason why, again, is due to the lack of craft and the lack of leadership in these publishing houses. I've long advocated ever since 2011 for a house cleaning at DC, and right now I'm advocating for a house cleaning at Marvel, because both companies really need to be swept clean if you hope to rebuild both of these brands and try to revive this comic book industry. Because what I'm seeing right now is a collapse that's going to be worse than the 1950s. Because back in the 1950s, when the comic book industry collapsed, there were some structures there that allowed it to stay alive. You had DC Comics, which was still trying to produce. You had Stan Lee at Marvel managing to produce a couple of titles. But what I see happening now is a collapse that's going to be worse than that, and this one could be downright devastating, because with the median age of a comic book reader being 40 years old, this is where companies like Warner Brothers and Disney pull the plug once and for all on the publication of new comics, because it reaches a point where they say the median age is 40, and once your median age is 40 for a product, that means that the audience that used to buy that product has now shrunk to the point where it is no longer profitable to appeal to them. This is why we don't see any more Oldsmobile Cutlass Supremes, Pontiac Trans Ams, or we see any other businesses like Woolworth, or products like Crown Pilot Crackers or Royal Lunch Milk Biscuits. The reason why we don't see those products is because the customer's median age is now over 40, and in the case of Crown Pilot Crackers and Royal Lunch Milk Biscuits, that median age was 60. So there was no audience for those products, and because there was no audience for the product, they had to discontinue the product. your comic book is headed on that road if it does not find an audience of new readers. If we don't find new readers who are younger, there isn't going to be a comic book industry to be able to be sustained, because you need to have a low median age if you hope to save an industry. Back in 1987, the median age for a comic book reader was 13 years old. When you have a median age of 13 years old, guess what? That means that the customer is going to age up, and that means the customer is going to eventually, what they call in business, age out. And once they age out, the next generation was supposed to come in. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened in the comic book industry, and that's why the comic book industry is headed towards the flat line that it has right now. The industry desperately needs new management, new leadership, and someone who has a vision towards working towards lowering that median age, reviving, making these characters interesting for the next generation, and telling stories that are relatable to readers of the next generation. Unfortunately, I don't see anyone like that coming up in the comic book industry, and that's why the comic book industry is going to die in the next 2 or 3 years. And again, it's going to be worse than the collapse of the 1950s, because once Disney and Warner Brothers decide to just go into reprints, a lot of people are going to be out of work, and they're going to have to try to do the best that they can, because that's going to be the end for everybody. Because once they go out, the indies have no place to really have any sort of support, because they get most of their business at the comic shop from people coming in at Marvel and DC. If comics do survive after that, it would probably be with web comics, because web comics are still doing strong. But as for print comics, it looks like it's almost near the last days. People are trying to save the industry, but the big problem is you have the wrong people working at these companies, and unless there's a house cleaning, nothing is going to stop the industry from heading towards a funeral where it's the end for comics. If you'd like to see me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon by clicking the link in the description box. And if you want to try some of the SJS Direct titles like I presented here, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.